I'm Michelle Donald and I'm a psychosexual therapist. I work mainly with people with spinal cord injury. I got into this work after a motorcycle accident in 1996 where I became paralysed at T12. So I'm completely paralysed at T12. People in the hospital were talking very much about how they were missing and how they were scared of their intimate lives together, whether their relationships would last. And for me, that was really prominent at that time because I was in a relationship that had only just started and was quite exciting. And then all of a sudden, I was paralysed, thinking, how do I manage my body now? What happens? How do I move it? I'd seen other people spasm. I didn't know if I would. I didn't know much about my injury, so there were so many questions in my head. And then sitting around talking to other people, there were so many questions for them as well. And it was really difficult at the time to find those answers. So at that point, I felt lost. I felt like I'd lost my identity as a woman, as a young female. And I thought, how am I going to move forward and feel feminine and be the person that I was? Because I think in hospital, we spend a lot of time wearing clothes that aren't necessarily the clothes we might have wore before. I know I was a high heel, short skirt kind of girl. And what happened was I ended up in tracksuit bottoms and trainers, which is something that I'd never existed in my life before. So my identity changed. And I think this is something that came to the forefront for a lot of people. Who are we now? How has this changed our lives? And it was such a big question about how we move forward. And then, bladder and bowel. How is this going to affect us moving forward? So all these questions were in my head, and not just my head, the people around me that I was speaking to. And it started me thinking about, actually, who can we talk to about this? Who can we talk to that has been through this experience before? And it was great having so much support in the Spinal Centre. But actually, I wanted peer support. I wanted people around me that had experienced these things and weren't embarrassed to talk about them. And that's where my brain started to go, actually, I could do that. I'm not embarrassed. And that's when I started to think, right, I'm going to move forward to help other people to manage this, because initially, it's so important to start talking about our intimate lives, our relationships, and our sexuality, as well as our sexual performance and how we do that moving forward. And if we don't get any hints or tips about how to do that early on, sometimes that stops us asking the questions. And sometimes it's us that needs to ask those questions initially, because people within our rehab centres, our healthcare workers, are actually terrified to ask us. So it became apparent that it needed to be me that was asking the questions. Going home on weekend leave was very frightening initially. Being able to get back into my own environment with my family and my partner. So I went home, and one of the first things my partner and I wanted to do was become intimate again together. So having the indwelling catheter inside of me and not knowing what was going to happen in the future with that, I didn't know where that catheter sat, and neither did my partner. I didn't know that that was directly into my urethra. I hadn't asked the questions. And I think, had I had the courage initially, had I not been so scared, perhaps I was ignorant at the time, thinking back. There was so much information that was given that only certain amounts were sticking, and then others, when you're fearful of something, it's really hard to ask that question when there's so much information. So the indwelling catheter sat inside of me, and I didn't know whether through penetrative sex that would be dislodged. So that was terrifying, actually, not just frightening. But I really wanted to be with my partner. And as he lay on top of me, and we tried to have penetrative sex, I realised at that point that I couldn't feel anything. And that was a shock to both of us. Now, that might sound quite silly. It might sound like, well, you're paralysed from your waist down, of course you can't feel anything. But we know with paralysis, it is so different. Every level of injury is very different. So being T12 is different to somebody else being T12. The sensations, the line is different. So we didn't know what to expect. And on that, I said to him, I feel nothing. And he said, I'm terrified. I didn't know if I was going to hurt your skin. I didn't know if I was going to dislodge your catheter. I didn't know if I was going to lubricate or not. I hadn't even thought about that myself. And had I asked at the hospital before I left, had I just had the courage to say, I have an indwelling catheter in, where does it sit? Who can show me a picture? I need pictures. Who can show me a picture of where that goes in my body? I would have felt so much more relaxed. It would have been such an easier experience. Had I asked that question, I know that a member of staff would have been able to open up that conversation and say, this is where it sits, this is what happens, this is a diagram, and then I would have had the courage to ask the next question, will I lubricate? And I think from there on, then that would have taken the stress away from the nurse or whoever I decided to ask that question to, because we find someone within our rehab usually that we can ask questions to, that we feel more comfortable with. I firmly believe one of the biggest things is communication. Asking the questions and actually being able to communicate with a partner. So asking the questions to the professionals about how our body works, what we do, but so much about communicating with a partner. So much about communicating with a new partner, so much about communicating with a care team. These are all people we really need to communicate with about our sensual self, about how we feel about our bodies now, because we have been touched and prodded and poked in our hospitals, in our spinal centres, in areas we didn't believe we'd ever get touched and prodded and poked by strangers. And then all of a sudden we have got to reclaim our bodies for ourselves. And some of us still have care teams around us. And in having a care team, it's about being able to differentiate that, being able to say, okay, this is my body now, but I have to hand it to you for this particular process, but this is not my choice, and box that off. And that can be really difficult initially to manage being touched by other people when we haven't asked for it, but we have to have that process happen. So to communicate with a partner can be really difficult about emotional things. And I think this is why sex often gets left to last for a lot of people. We have so much to deal with before we can often think about that, think about being intimate with a partner. And our partners are often really scared of asking us. If we're dating, how do we put ourselves out there? How do we describe ourselves now? I think that's really powerful. And I work a lot with people looking at dating profiles. How do they want to be seen now? Where does it fit for them? Where is their personality again? And initially we'll look at a dating profile, maybe sometimes 6 months down the line, and they'll write something. And then they'll review it 2 years down the line and how different that has become, really looking at how you've changed as and grown. Often how we describe ourselves initially is quite difficult. I'm paraplegic. And so it's okay. How are we going to soften that? How are we going to tell a person how that affects our life without it feeling too much? So we look at, let's just have a line for that. And and how are we going to show ourselves on a dating profile. And often, even if we're in a relationship or we've been in a long-term relationship, having these conversations with our partners about how we see ourselves, how we might describe ourselves, and asking them, how do they see us? What do they see now? And having those open discussions. And a lot of the work that I do as a psychosexual therapist is looking at how people view each other. And often when you've been in rehab, you've spent a long time apart. Things have changed at home. And it is about how then that we renegotiate who we are and how we move forward with that. This is a good time to bring in how we see ourselves. Our own sexuality is so different for all of us. It's unique. Like our spinal cord injury, everything is completely unique and different. What one person feels and cherishes is completely different often to other people. So it's about our culture, our race, our religion, how we've been brought up, how we feel about ourselves, our past experiences. Within the work that I do, it's always about taking the history, the past experience about how we see ourselves. And one of the biggest things there is about having the confidence to move forward and play. Because if we don't play, we're not going to get that good feedback loop. And actually, sex and affection, relationships are often about having a good feedback loop. The feedback loop is so important in that it enables us to play. If we get good feedback, we want to do something again. And the less we get that good feedback, the less we want to do that. So when I came out of hospital and the experience of me and my partner being back together again, that was a bad feedback loop. And it took us a long, long time to move away from that, because in between we had to communicate, and then our relationship had to become playful again. And then that enabled us to start initiating again. And I think initiation is a massive point, and I talk about initiation with my clients all the time. Initiation is so important. When one person stops initiating, because we've always got one person that will initiate and one person that initiates less. And often the spinal injury can upset that balance. So we'll go, actually, I'm not going to initiate today because I know you've been in a lot of neurological pain, or I've noticed that you're really tired. I've noticed that your medication has changed something for you. So I'm not going to initiate sex or even affection because I might hurt you. And vice versa. I've noticed that, things have been hard for you today. You've had so much to do. You've been working really hard. Whoever your partner is and whatever they're doing, often we put their needs first and forget. So it's about that communication. If that feedback loop is good, if we're having a good response, we're more likely to ask again. So initiation plays a big part in the work that I do. Body mapping is really important. Body mapping is about the communication. So I'll always ask people to body map initially. So body mapping is about touching your body or your partner's body and your own initially, touching your body if you can, or using something to touch your body with, or using your imagination to take you to somewhere that feels good. So these are all techniques that I use within the work that I do. But also we can do a lot of this on our own. So we can look at, if you're in a couple relationship, really looking at touching each other from top to bottom. So if you're comfortable naked, actually touching each other from top to bottom. How does it feel? Communicate about that. Communicate about, actually, I know you can't feel me touching your legs right now, but watch me. Our brain will connect to certain things. And you'll move your hands up your partner's body. And you'll communicate through that. Or you'll communicate at the end, whichever feels comfortable for you. You will add into that things like oil, temperature changes, to really, and this isn't about being sexual, this is about gaining that body confidence again, how you move around each other again. That's so important. We often get a little bit scared about a spasm happening, or the room that we have, or how comfortable our body is, or how we move our body. Sometimes in a bigger chair, it might be easier to stay in the wheelchair to actually do some of this movement. There was a couple that I worked with that really sticks with me. He was a high-level tetraplegic, and they're a heterosexual couple, and she wanted to hold him. He'd been in the spinal centre for so long. And we set up that they could go to this room and be able to spend time together, private time together. We know how difficult that can be in a rehabilitation setting. And she actually took off her top and she just had her bra on, and she was able to get behind him. So we were able to take the back off the chair at this point, and she just held him from behind, skin on skin, for the first time in months. What did that do? Oxytocin release. It enabled them both to feel comfortable. It enabled them both to cry. They came back into my session so connected at how amazing that experience had been. So sometimes this is about a hug, it's about a touch, it's about skin on skin. There's your good feedback loop. There's your communication. And then that leads on to other things. So when I'm talking about body mapping, it can start in simple ways. You don't have to both be on a bed. You don't have to both be led down. This is about using your imagination and being creative and playing. It's about touch. And actually, even the time of day makes such a difference. So looking at how we perceive touch, how we feel touch, where in our body. So food can sometimes have a big impact. The medication and the time we take on medication can have a big impact. Even stress during the day. So it's about scheduling and finding a good time of day that works for you, or plan a week. Look at a week. I often get my clients to look at the week and go, okay, on such a night, this could happen, and on such a morning, and then get people to really think about how they initiate moving forward from that stage. So moving your hands up and down each other's bodies. There's a couple I also work with where he has been able to hold something in his mouth with something on the end, and he'd actually chosen a feather, and then they'd moved it onto harder things that he held, and he moved that up and down his partner's body. And they said, that's the first time that I've felt wanted and needed, because he had to make an effort to touch me again, because I was always the one that's made the effort because he's got lazy. And I come across this in many spinal relationships way down the line, where the spinal partner gets lazy. So one of the biggest tips I can give you is don't get lazy. Even if there's something you think you can't do, use your imagination. Talk to your partner. Say, actually, I want you to do this. I can't, but I want you to do it. Talk to people all the time about how to work with their PAs, asking their PAs to bring things in or set up a room. You don't ask them, you don't tell them what's going to be going on, you just ask them to give you private time. Setting boundaries is a huge thing, and we can start that within our rehabilitation centres. Saying, actually, I need time out for 2 hours. I need this space or that space, knowing that it's a time that's going to be more appropriate to our healthcare professional. So I think setting boundaries is massive. Being able to shut doors, lock doors. One of the biggest issues people have are pets coming in all the time. So some of those are simple things, but the body mapping is huge, and I'd just ask you to think about that now. In hindsight, I would have asked more questions in the spinal centre to enable that communication. I would have communicated so much more with people. I would have put myself out there more. As in, I would have, because of my body image, and I know this happens for a lot of people, I stayed home, I became quite quiet, which wasn't me. And I think finding myself was the biggest way forward for me. I became confident, I got fitter. And this is what I hear from so many of my clients. When they find themselves again, when they I became Michelle again because I lost her. When that happens, it's then that the confidence shines through. So when I got into a new relationship, I said to my partner, why me? Why would you want to go out with somebody who is in a wheelchair when you could choose anyone? And he said, because you're confident, because you smile, because you hold yourself well. All of those things I would never, ever have imagined somebody saying to me originally when I was first in my chair. So that was huge for me, knowing that I'd travelled that journey. I think also having that confidence sexually for a lot of my clients comes from that experimenting, from being able to communicate and open up to themselves. Little messages all the time. My psychologist said to me when I said, I have horrible legs and I can't stand the way they look and I don't want to pick them up. And he said, okay, knowing you, this is what I suggest you do. So he suggested I wore stockings, not stockings with a suspender belt, just hold-ups that stayed on my legs with the seam at the side, so it wasn't harming my skin. And actually, over time, I would look down at my legs and my automatic message to myself was, oh, they look pretty, rather than, oh, that's a disgusting piece of meat. So I got where he was coming from in the end. Those little messages can make all the difference to us. Looking at ourselves in the mirror and going, that's okay. Looking at ourselves in a full-length mirror and finding the bits that we like and looking at those. It takes time, but it's an amazing journey to rediscover ourselves and find out how amazing that journey moving forward can be if we don't get stuck in our past sexual life. We have to open up, rediscover, and move forward. So if you could take one thing away from our time together today, it is communicate. Ask questions. And if you need to seek help, ask questions. Get the help that you need. I've compiled a list of resources that will hopefully be a good start in how to move forward in your own time. To work with this, to think about what you want, to rediscover yourself in the ways that you want to do that. There are hints and tips on dating. There are hints and tips on so many things, striptease even. There are hints and tips on slow start, on the body work that I spoke about. There's a lot of resources there for you to play with, for you to look at. Some of it might be applicable to you, some of it may not. This is all about finding that new you, exploring the difference in your body now with yourself and with another partner, if that's what you choose to do. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm Michelle Donald, Senior Accredited Psychosexual Therapist for the AccCOSRT. AccCOSRT is the College of Sex and Relationship Therapists. Thank you.